Good morning. I was asked by Wendy and Kate to address a different perspective on the Arab awakening, and that is the implications for U.S. policy in the Arab-Israeli conflict and peace process. So I will do that, and then perhaps if there's some time remaining, comment on a couple of the things that my colleagues have addressed thus far. For inspiration in looking at the current state of the peace process, I recalled the Monty Python skit of the 100 meters dash for runners with no sense of direction, in which the runners line up at the starting gate and the gun goes off and they head off in all kinds of different ways. And it's easy to see why this is inspiration for where we are in the peace process. Palestinians, as we know, are seriously frustrated, both with what they perceive to be the unwillingness of the Israeli government to stop settlements and to articulate a position that would be reasonable in order to bring about negotiations. They are equally frustrated with the United States for what they perceive as the U.S. having put them, as they say, up in a tree with no ladder, having demanded a settlements freeze from Israel and then not having been able to achieve it. And therefore, the Palestinians have turned in two different directions. One, to achieve reconciliation with Hamas and to try to bring about national unity, which always has been a major goal and value within Palestinian society. And secondly, to try to bring about membership of the state of Palestine in international organizations, both in the United Nations and in the specialized agencies. All of those elements of Palestinian policy are understandable against the backdrop of frustration, but they also suggest a turn away from negotiations, at least as an immediate tactic and strategy for the Palestinian national movement. Israel, for its purposes, has been quite nervous about the implications for Israeli security of the Arab awakening and the question of the durability of its peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. These are concerns that have in fact proved to be somewhat grounded in reality. We know that for example, the Tahrir uprising did not articulate as any of its immediate goals any kind of change in Egypt's policy with Israel, but several months later, frustration on the part of a segment of the population with the failure of the awakening to produce the kind of results that the people wanted, long-standing grievances on the part of Egyptians toward the Egyptian government and its policy toward Israel, spilled over into the streets and ultimately into the Israeli embassy in downtown Cairo. And so Israel is concerned about the implications on both its security and the durability of the peace treaties with its neighbors, but has reacted to it in a way that, in a sense, makes no sense, by continuing its settlement activity, by posing preconditions, for example, recognition of the character of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, which, in a sense, take it as far away from the prospect of resuming negotiations as Palestinian policy has taken the Palestinian national movement. And for our part, on the part of the administration, first of all, we're fatigued. This is an administration which, as we know, started out on day one with a president who said that the peace process is a U.S. national security interest. The president appointed a high-level envoy. Despite the proliferation of issues on the president's agenda, many of them of far greater moment for American interests than the Middle East peace process, the president has nonetheless taken presidential time to try to advance the prospects for a Middle East peace settlement. And yet each tactic tried by the United States, whether it was a confidence-building measure in the demand for a settlements freeze, whether it was the idea of proximity talks, whether it was the very short-lived notion of final status talks, or whether it was what the president said last May, the idea of starting negotiations with borders and security, each one of these, having failed, has left the United States tired and upset and angry. It's a question of whether or not the administration continues to have a stomach for moving on the peace process, certainly in this first term of President Obama. And in fact, we are now entered into election mode, in which it is far brighter for an administration to turn its attention to jobs, jobs, and jobs, rather than to embark on risky policies overseas in the Middle East peace process. The problem is that as we look at this race for runners with no sense of direction, there's an implicit idea that somehow the status quo can be maintained. The process can be left to its own devices, at least for the immediate period ahead, on the part of the United States for the next year until after the election. And that perhaps at some point where things are in better shape, the parties and the United States can pick up where they left off and try to advance the prospects of a final peace settlement. We know, however, that status quos are not static. Things either get better or they get worse. And in the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict, things have a tendency to get worse. They don't improve in and of themselves. Even if they were to try to improve in and of themselves, there are spoilers, on both sides, that will actively seek to undermine that status quo and to advance their particular spoiler interests. There are continued bad behaviors on both sides, whether it's terrorism and rocket fire from some elements of Palestinian society, whether it's settlement activity and violence on the part of some within Israeli society, bad behaviors which have always plagued the Middle East peace process will play a particularly important role if everyone is trying to maintain a very delicate status quo. As noted, the absence of movement in the process can also become a rallying cry for those who are not gaining what they want in terms of democracy and, as Ron suggested, I think most importantly, economic benefit from this Arab awakening. And there's no easier place to turn than supporting the Palestinian cause for Arab masses that are stifled in their desire for enhancing their ability to influence the politics and economics of their society. So if one can suggest that the status quo is an okay place to be during this period of confusion and different directions of strategy, I think one would be terribly mistaken. And yet, especially in Washington, if one argues to try to advance the Middle East peace process, in general or specifically today, one faces what I have come to call the quote-unquote Washington consensus. Many of you have sat around tables of peace process discussions and commissions and groups and working groups, and one hears a series of arguments why the United States should not today be in the business of advancing a serious Middle East peace process strategy. This is what I call that Washington consensus. First of all, we hear that we really have not reached a period of ripeness. You know, this idea of a mutually hurting stalemate, which in the literature suggests one has to reach in order to make a conflict resolution possible. I don't know what we are in if not a mutually hurting stalemate. In some respects, Palestinian society, having benefited a great deal over the past couple of years from economic and some political growth, will reach a point where that will become impossible to pursue. And it may reach a point sooner rather than later. We're now hearing that as one of the impacts of reconciliation, one of the most important people within the Palestinian Authority, Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, may become the sacrificial lamb, thrown overboard in order to maintain a national unity, but thrown overboard having tried to shepherd in a period of Palestinian economic and political development. Israel enjoys economic growth, member of international organizations dedicated to growth. But how far can a country go that it remains isolated among all of its neighbors and remains some kind of an island in a sea of continued animosity? So if there is such a definition of a mutually hurting stalemate, one can suggest that it already exists between Arabs and Israelis. And therefore, the ripeness for resolving this conflict has been with us for some time. A second argument you hear in Washington is it's really hard. It's very hard to do. And the reality is, of course, that argument is correct. It is hard to do. If it were easy, it would have been done many years ago. But I would suggest that American diplomacy, like our military, is able to do hard things. We've had 3 experiences in the past where, with very important American assistance, breakthroughs have occurred in the Middle East. In the 1970s, with the Kissinger step-by-step shuttle diplomacy, we achieved 3 disengagement agreements involving Egypt and Syria. Through the diplomacy of Jimmy Carter, we helped broker the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And through the efforts of the George H.W. Bush administration, we helped bring about the Madrid Peace Conference, which launched the current phase of peacemaking that we have been living through. None of these efforts was easy. The people we had to deal with were not pushovers. Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir on the Israeli side, Hafez al-Assad and others on the Arab side, they were as difficult leaders to deal with as any. And yet, persistent, strong, determined American diplomacy was able to help make a difference. So the argument that this is too hard is an argument for capitulation, which I don't accept. Third argument, well, the leaders are too weak. And that may in fact be the case. There are weak leaders in the Middle East, too ready to retreat rather than advance, too willing to forego the possibility of exploiting openings rather than not. The reality is that no one from outside the region can shape leadership. But the United States can challenge leaders to be something that they may not be today. And if those leaders don't take up that challenge, we can also challenge their societies to push their leadership to do the things that have to be done. Now, I don't argue for U.S. interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. We don't do that, or at least we say we don't do that. But I would argue that the United States can pose choices for other societies that sometimes those other societies cannot pose for themselves. And if we don't do it, sometimes no one else will. So yes, leaders are weak, but why wouldn't we then challenge those leaders to either become strong or to stand aside for leaders who will take up the challenge of peacemaking? And then you hear the argument in Washington, well, we can't want peace more than the parties themselves. The hair on the back of my neck stands up whenever I hear this. Because, of course, it's true. This is an Arab-Israeli conflict. Arabs and Israelis have to solve this conflict. But my goodness, this has been a U.S. national security interest for more than 30 years. And to hide behind that silly slogan as though that somehow gives us an excuse not to get engaged in serious policymaking makes no sense. Now, if we have a leadership in the United States that says, you know, we're no longer interested in the Middle East peace process, we're walking away, it's not an American interest, we can have a different kind of debate. I would argue against it, but at least we can have a debate over whether or not we do want peace as much as the parties. But our presidents, in most cases, have already determined that this is important to the United States. So why would we argue today not to be involved in the peace process when it's our own national interest that's involved? And then we hear the argument, well, what if we fail? Things might be worse if we fail. And I've never heard of a diplomatic activity which is stopped in its tracks because the prospect of failure looms. All diplomatic activity holds the prospect of failure. And in fact, in some diplomatic cases, we have received no for an answer. But the successes that we've registered in the past have often been successes in which we have turned no's into yeses. One of the great privileges that I had during my career was to serve in the administration of George H.W. Bush on Secretary Baker's peace team. We got no's from Israel and Syria in the course of the summer of 1991. We tried to advance the idea of a Madrid peace conference. We didn't know it would be in Madrid at the time. The idea of a conference leading to negotiations, and both leaderships said to us no. We didn't take no for an answer. Now, there was no guarantee that not taking no for an answer would lead ultimately to yes, but that's what diplomacy is all about. It's trying to shape outcomes that are consistent with the interests that have driven you into the diplomatic activity in the first place. And so this question of, well, what if we fail, is a question for people who don't want to do diplomacy, and I'm not one of them. Finally, we get two other questions, particularly this year. Number one, we have a lot of other priorities. As I mentioned, jobs and jobs and jobs, and we have other foreign policy priorities. Steve noted some of those in his comments earlier this morning. And the reality is that we do have other priorities. And this is a president who's being pulled in many directions in order to address a myriad problems that face our society. But it's also a president who has defined this issue as one of those priorities. And you therefore can't walk away from something that you've invested in for 3 years by arguing that we now have other priorities. Because then your opponents can say, well, why did you invest in this in the first place? In other words, the strongest position, I would argue, for a president in a first term seeking re-election who has invested heavily already in trying to make peace is to continue until the day of the next election in order to say to the American people, I've told you this is a priority, I've been working on this, and I'm going to work on it until my first term is ended and hopefully into my second. And that leads to the last question. Well, why just not wait until after the next election? And we go back full circle to the idea of a status quo. It ain't going to work. Things will not get better. They're certainly not going to be the same, and they will be far worse. So having dispensed with this so-called Washington consensus, the question then looms, and it's the last question I'll pose. Can we do anything? And I would argue that rather than try another tactic, another discrete approach, each one of which in the past 3 years has not worked, why don't we try an American strategy? Why don't we have a comprehensive look at what needs to be done? And I would suggest this includes 4 elements. Number one, Obama parameters. Now, we don't have to make them up out of the blue. We know where the negotiations left off in 2008. We have heard from former Prime Minister Olmert in his recently released book how close he believes the parties came. We know from the leaked Palestine papers that even the Palestinians believe the negotiations had made substantial progress. And we know from Condoleezza Rice's just released book that she agrees that these negotiations narrowed the gap substantially. And so the parameters that Mr. Obama inherited from Mr. Clinton can now be refined and sharpened and narrowed. And they can become American policy of where negotiations should start. Secondly, as well as Palestinians have done in institution building and security reforms, they have to do more. The last thing we would want in the context of an Arab awakening is to create a Palestinian state that becomes a failed state. And I don't think Palestine will be a failed state. The people are too qualified and too educated and too committed to the idea of making Palestine work. But we can use these next months, this next year, this next 2 years, to enhance Palestinian institutions, to build the capacity for Palestinians to govern themselves, and to continue to work hard on security reform. Third, roadmap implementation. You know the saying in the Middle East that you're not really dead until you're dead and buried. Mm-hmm. The roadmap has been dead for a few years, but it's not yet buried. And the fact is that Israel and Palestine have both agreed to implement that roadmap that requires fundamental changes in behavior. It's about time that we ask them to do what they said they're prepared to do, to hold them accountable through monitoring, and to exact consequences when they fail to carry out their responsibilities. In the context of negotiating process, this could make a great deal of sense. And finally, number 4, we have an Arab peace initiative that's been sitting out there since 2002, reiterated in 2007, and nobody's done anything with it. I've suggested often since 2002 that there's been a cosmic change in Arab states' behavior and positions inherent in that Arab peace initiative. And the failure of all of us, including the Arabs, to see through and activate their own initiative is one of the great losses of this past decade. And why not use this opportunity then to bring the Arab world again, as it was in the 1990s, into a peacemaking process through discussions, negotiations on issues of health and water and environment, issues which know no borders, issues which need to be resolved even if Palestinians and Israelis have trouble reaching a final status agreement. Not only would those negotiations activated through the Arab Peace Initiative be important, but they would also provide encouragement and perhaps even a safety net for Palestinian decision-making in favor of peace. Thank you very much.